So if I'm standing here, that works. Maybe a little bit higher. That seems good. We can adjust it if we need to.
Whatever you did yesterday was good.
Which microphone? Is some Rabbi? Could you go to the office to check the voice? To check the audio.
Testing audio. Yeah, looks like we got volume.
You're definitely through the live system.
Yeah, it did the speaker mic test.
It did the speaker mic test. And
Your camera's
okay.
good.
Yeah, the hostess disabled all the.
Okay.
So I think we're all right, I'm just going to stand here in front of the microphone because I think Rabbi Spitzer is probably online in his office now, and if I check this, if I'm here looking at the microphone, he'll be able to hear me talking, and then I'll be able to tell whether he's got a signal or not. All right, I hope Rabbi heard some of that. Rabbi's online now. Rabbi, you got sound? To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether it is noble in mind, yeah, that's about, I can't get much farther than that.
Is the sound any better now? If you could chat me back, that would be great. That was to Rabbi. Is sound any better now? No?
On your system, you should have the ability to. Oh, yeah, we have no system through the system here. That's just moving the mic back a little bit will probably help. Yeah, and then the type. Settings. Yeah. There should be one for sound. Sound mixer options. That's the output. Input's what we're going to do. Testing the microphone. How much volume? Oh, we're not getting that much. Oh, that's the system. Oh, yeah, you know you lost me. Not mine. Oh. My microphone array there. Well, hang on.
Okay. For people online, I hope it's working better, but we're going to move forward. And here you can take your mask off.
Okay. So we're going to start again. So the people who are online, I understand, did not get what I said for the first 10 minutes. So just to recap my recap of the weekend, I took advantage of the fact that the teenagers are here to say that the problem that we're dealing with is not unexpected, but there's a decline with every age cohort of interest in Israel among Jews of North America, especially the United States. So the generation born during the creation of the State of Israel, during the Holocaust, is the most involved with Israel, and then my generation is a little less, and then the generation after that, still less. And if the trends continue, we have every reason to believe that the generation that's represented here with our teenagers is going to be a generation, if they're not Orthodox, they're not going to care very much about Israel at all. And there are two major difficulties which everyone sees with this. The first is political, that Israel needs support from the United States in order to survive. And some people think you can depend on evangelicals to supply that support from the United States, but I don't think so. And it's also a problem for the Jewish community. If you have almost half the world's Jews living in Israel and 40-some% of the world's Jews living in the United States, not to have those two huge Jewish communities be closely involved with each other is just a shame. It's a loss. It's a disgrace. It hurts Judaism and it hurts the Jewish people. So the question is what we can do about it. And then, as my final word of introduction, I said, well, if you're going to tackle a problem, you should understand the various dimensions of the problem so you can pick out the pieces you can address and separate them from the pieces you can't do anything about. And so I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes or so reviewing or introducing notions of what the problems are. So in 1986, I came out with a book called Galut, Modern Jewish Reflection on Homelessness and Homecoming, which talked about the gap in the way Israeli Jews and American Jews see the tradition of Judaism that we share. I'll come back to that. But I think because of that book, I was invited in 1990 to write an essay for the American Jewish Committee on this growing gap. And I listed like a half dozen factors, which I'm going to briefly review now. Not in any order of importance. On some we can do something about, and you'll see there's some we can't do anything about. So to start off with an obvious thing, the American Jewish population is overwhelmingly of Ashkenazi descent. And Israel is not. So the huge representation of Mizrahi Jews and other Sephardi Jews in Israel. And then you had an immigration from the former Soviet Union to the United States, but you had a much larger immigration to Israel with a much larger impact on the country. So in that respect, let's call this ethnically, our two communities are different. Secondly, in terms of experience, I would say one of the dominant experiences of Israeli life is army service. And army service, sadly, usually means combat experience. And it's something that a previous generation of American Jews had in World War II in Korea. There were not a lot of American Jews who served in Vietnam. And now that you have an all-volunteer army, there are not a lot of Jews. Of course there are some. And at JTS we tried to supply chaplains to these people. And I myself went to West Point a couple times. But you want to understand that this is a major fact of life for Israelis, and it's not a major fact of life for American Jews, and it's a big divide. There's another divide in experience which I will name, which is that because of traditions and because of size, Israeli families spend a lot more time together. So Friday night dinner, I know it's not just me, but there's statistics, lots of Israelis will travel hours and hours to come home for Friday night dinner. The country permits this. But it's also a matter of culture, as I said, that family is much more important, perhaps because of the wars and the military service, but people are tighter. These family ties are tighter and more important. There's a third obvious difference, which is language. So most Israelis learn some English in school. The vast majority of American Jews know no Hebrew whatsoever. And although you can have a conversation with many Israelis in English, if you are fluent in Hebrew, you know that you're having a different conversation in Hebrew than you're having in English. So when official conversations happen between Israeli leaders and American leaders, they happen in English. But I can tell you from personal experience that if you want Israelis to really open up to you, you better talk in Hebrew, because it's just more natural. It's like more intimate. And so you have a different conversation. So a lot of the problem with the gap is lack of Hebrew, and that's on our side, as we say, that's on us. Because if you have parents or grandparents from Central or Eastern Europe, it was very common for people who did not have much formal education to speak 3 and 4 languages. If you go a little north to Canada, right, you're going to speak 2 languages at least. Why American Jews who live in Tucson, Arizona or San Antonio, Texas do not speak Spanish is kind of a mystery until you realize it must be intentional. It's part of the American culture, and maybe it's to draw that boundary line to say we're not them, we're us. So they speak Spanish and we don't. But whatever it is, Americans do not learn languages, and I'm convinced, and other people are, that if more Americans were bilingual, more Jews would have Hebrew. But that's a major source of the gap between us. Number 5, there's a gap in practice. So I'm just going to hold up some charts that were published in recent studies of Israeli observance. So the percentage actually of Haredi Jews in Israel, even though they play a major role in politics, is not all that different than the percentage of Haredi Jews in the United States. 7, 8%, something like that. However, the percentage of modern Orthodox Jews is much larger. So in the United States, the percentage of modern Orthodox Jews, this may surprise you in how small it is, but it's still only between 2 and 3% of Jews. However, in Israel, it's significantly larger, 8%, something like that. Now, the percentage of Jews, to what extent do you observe tradition? The percentage that says meticulously is 14%. You would not say that about American Jews. To a great extent, 26%. So you add up meticulously and to a great extent, you get 40% of Israeli Jews are really observant. And that is very different than American Jews. We're going to see the particular observances in 1 second. So, for example, I don't have all the American statistics. Circumcision, 94% in Israel. Sitting Shiva, 92%. Bar and Bar Mitzvah, 91%. Saying Kaddish for parents, 90%. Being married by a rabbi, 80%, because it's hard to not be married by an Orthodox rabbi in Israel. But in America, much, much less. I could go on. Fasting on Yom Kippur, 68%. American Jews, way below half, way below half. Lighting Hanukkah candles, 80%, much, much less than the United States. Hearing a Megillah on Purim, 67% of Israelis. Now remember, the Orthodox percentage is still small, and yet 67% of Israelis think it's important to hear the Megillah read on Purim. This is astonishing. I'm sorry, I misled you. 36% hear the Megillah on Purim. 36%. Attending a Passover Seder, which used to be the norm in America, is still 90% in Israel, and it's way down. I don't remember, but something like 70% of American Jews will have a Passover Seder of some sort. So, observance levels themselves are now a gap. So let's say that less observant Israeli Jews are by and large much more observant than more observant American Jews. So the relationship to the tradition is different, and you can think of many causes for this, but one thing is, if you ask them about their connection to the Jewish people, the overwhelming majority of Israelis will say, yes, I feel a connection to and a responsibility for and an obligation to Jewish people no matter where they're living. And as I said yesterday, if you ask American Jews, do you feel any obligation to other Jews above and beyond your obligation to humanity in general, half will say yes and half will say no. So there's a difference there. And finally, the last difference I'll learn is just ignorance, and this is on both sides. Israeli curricula, Israeli students in school do not learn about us, and depending on which summer camp you go to as a Jew or which Hebrew school you go to as a Jew, you might learn something about Israel, but remember, the vast majority of American Jews do not get any kind of Jewish education. That's the statistic that one has to be worried about. The vast majority of American Jews, 60%, as I said the other day, but not all of you heard it, 60% of American Jews do not belong to anything Jewish, will not write a check to anything Jewish this year. Over 60% will not. Less than 40% will. It used to be that 40% belonged to synagogues or 50% belonged to synagogues. Those days are gone. And the percentage slips every year. So if affiliation counts for something, or contribution to federation counts for something, American Jews are by and large not there. So when you talk about the collective of American Jewry, if American Jewry exists at all, it's with a fraction of American Jewry that can, in any meaningful sense, be said to be part of this community. Whereas when you say Israeli Jews, by definition, because they all pay taxes to this state and they all do army service to this state, and it impinges on their lives every day, for better and for worse. Whether they got COVID vaccines depended on a healthcare system which was an Israeli healthcare system where Jewish values figured into the policy decisions of that healthcare system. Whether you get vaccines in America depends on federal and state and local authorities. Right? So it's a very different set of circumstances. All right. In 1990, two sociologists, Charles Liebman and Stephen Cohen, wrote a book about the two worlds of Judaism, and they listed three further distinctions which still hold. And they're a little more abstract, but I think we'll all be able to understand them easily. One is that most American Jews want to see Judaism be a universal faith. They want to see Judaism espouse values that really apply to everybody, so we can tell our friends and neighbors with sincerity and authenticity, you see, our values are your values as well. Jews care about the whole world. I wrote my dissertation in my first book on the idea of the Jews being God's chosen people, and that idea has been a public relations problem for Jews since the 1930s and 40s. Because why should we accept you as part of the larger whole of America if you are a chosen people? So Jews here tend to downplay what we call Jewish particularity and to highlight what we call Jewish universality. The phrase these days is tikkun olam. And it's real. It's a real part of Judaism. It's important. But the point is that for Israelis, the particularity, what singles Jews out, is more obvious. As I said last night, trying to get into the consciousness of Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook, what other people is there? Can you name one other people that has resurrected a state that was gone for 2,000 years and made it live again? The answer is no, you can't. There's no other example. What other people has resurrected a language and made it a spoken language when it hadn't been a spoken language for 2,000 years? Nobody else has done that. What other people is trying to combine nationality and religion and all these kinds of things the way we are? No other people does this. So the uniqueness is striking, and for political reasons and social reasons, but also sincere religious reasons in America, we tend to downplay the particularity and to highlight the universality is the opposite in Israel. Second of all, goes along with that, in America, whether to be Jewish or not depends on an individual decision. So you all, I'm looking at the teenagers again, you all are going to have the chance many times in your life, as many times as you want, to choose whether to opt in or opt out. Am I going to be Jewish? I could be something else. Am I going to be Jewish in this way? Am I going to be Jewish in that way? Will I marry a Jew? Will I marry a non-Jew? Etc., etc. All these choices are yours as individuals to make, and nobody can stop you from making them. And there's going to be some pressure on you, maybe from your family, but even that is less and less. Whereas in Israel, it's not an individual choice, it's a collective. It's a collective, it's part of a community. And the third thing is, when American Jews talk about Judaism, they tend to emphasize ethics. Again, because that's universal, and it relates to everybody, and it always has been a core of Judaism. Israelis tend to emphasize history. Israelis will emphasize history. So I wanted to drive that point home. This is a column I wrote a couple years ago when we spent Hanukkah in Tel Aviv. I mentioned it yesterday. And I'm just going to read the first paragraph from this essay I wrote called Home for the Holidays, which describes an experience I had in 2014 at Hanukkah in Israel. As I was driving in Tel Aviv the other day, a commercial came on the radio that caused me to sit up and take notice. It featured Ma'oz Tzur, sung to the tune of Jingle Bells, right? It's a commercial in Israel. So, of course, according to get the commercial, you have to know what Jingle Bells is, and you have to know what Ma'oz Tzur is, right? Ma'oz Tzur is. I can't even do it. I'm trying to do it in my head now. Ma'oz Tzur, Yeshua, da 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 da, right? Followed by a resonant male voice that asked the listener to imagine what might happen if Santa Claus lit Hanukkah candles this year. Many Israelis are making a similar move, the announcer continued, trading in German-made automobiles for Cadillacs. Shouldn't you think of joining them? I couldn't believe this was actually a commercial for Cadillac against German cars at Hanukkah. And the idea is, unless I'm reading too much into it, and I don't think I am, Santa Claus is not Hanukkah. Jingle Bells is not Ma'oz Tzur. Germans are not friends to Jews. So I know a lot of people of my parents' generation who would not buy German cars. My father wouldn't buy a Ford because of Henry Ford's anti-Semitism. So here's an announcer in Israel on the radio publicly telling people that it's un-Jewish to buy a German car. I could not believe it at Hanukkah. But why I wrote this in the column is because for Israelis, Hanukkah is not primarily a religious observance. You don't like Hanukkah candles because you believe that God saved the Jewish people. You like Hanukkah candles because you say, I am connected to Jewish history. And 2,000 years ago, a foreign invading power tried to snuff out a Jewish independent state. And today we have these foreign powers that are trying to stuff out our Jewish state. And so we celebrate Hanukkah because we are part of the same story. Well, American Jews might feel that, but it's not as immediate as in Israel. You might say there is no symmetry here. So the Israel-diaspora relationship is asymmetric in all sorts of ways. We're just coming at things from a very different angle. I want to say two more things about it from our side and then a couple things from their side, and then we're going to turn to the solution. One is, in this book, Galut, I wanted to know what have American Jewish thinkers of the previous generation, the great American Jewish thinkers. We don't have great American Jewish thinkers of this generation. People often ask me why. That's a different subject. But the generation of Abraham Joshua Heschel and Joseph Soloveitchik and the Reform movement Eugene Borowitz or Emil Fackenheim or the Lubavitcher Rebbe, where are the great Jewish thinkers of this generation? Well, We don't have them, but if you go to the previous generation, in the 50s, Soloveitchik had to convince Orthodox Jews in America to care about Israel. Somebody asked me, when did that change for Orthodoxy? It's a fact that Soloveitchik addressed the convention of the Orthodox Zionist movement, Mizrahi, in the 1950s and had to argue the case for Zionism against those who were opposed to it. But listen to what Rabbi Soloveitchik said about Israel. He said, "I understand the greatness, value, and importance of the state, the wonder of its establishment and preservation, only from the point of view of the uniqueness of the people of Israel and its relation to the God of Israel. As a secular historical entity that is not animated by any covenantal goal, the state does not excite me. And I cannot imagine any tie between the Jews of the diaspora and the state insofar as it is secular." And that's an interesting point of view. Remember, in the 1950s, the religious parties in Israel were much less powerful than they are now. Ben Gurion is very much in charge. The Labor Party is in charge. It's a secular party. Some of it is anti-religious. And Soloveitchik is saying, if Israel turns out to be a secular state, I'm not going to care about it. And line that up with what I said about American Jews a minute ago. Most American Jews have the opposite orientation. For most American Jews who are not religious, right, the percentage of American Jews that are Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox combined is around, 12%, something like that. If you add conservative Jews, you get another 10, 11, 12%. Reformed Jews, another 12, 11, 10%, right? So the great majority of American Jews do not identify religiously. They don't have any interest in the state of Israel if it's going to be an overwhelmingly religious state. The Soloveitchik, an Orthodox thinker, doesn't want to deal with a secular state. American Jews don't want to deal with a religious state. There's a problem built into our being both. My major influence, Abraham Joshua Heschel, the man who means more to me than any other Jewish thinker, wrote a book after the 1967 war called Israel, an Echo of Eternity. Israel, an Echo of Eternity. And if you read that book, it's really interesting to find that Heschel waxes eloquent and poetic as always about the land of Israel and about the people of Israel and about the miracle of the Jewish people being back in the land of Israel speaking the Hebrew language. He says very little about the political establishment, the state of Israel. The state is for him an instrument to secure the land and the people, and not really a value in its own right. So listen to a paragraph that Heschel wrote in that book, Israel, an Echo of Eternity. Our imperishable homeland is in God's time. We enter God's time through the gate of sacred deeds, mitzvot. The deeds, acts of sanctifying time, are the old ancestral ground where we meet God again and again. The great sacred deed for us today is to build the land of Israel. So this is Heschel, who of course made a distinction between time and space and said, we Jews sanctify time, not space. Gentiles sanctify space. Yeah, but that's a diaspora point of view, and if you've ever been to the Kotel, you can see a lot of Jews now sanctifying space. It's holy space. And the Eidot HaMizrach people who make pilgrimages to the tombs of those old saintly rabbis up in the Galilee are sanctifying space. But Heschel is saying here, we Jews are not into sanctifying space. We're into sanctifying time. That's a gap. Insofar as that attitude is prevalent among American Jews, it's a gap between the two. Finally, it is common for Israeli Jews, and somewhat less so in American Jews, and this was the topic last night, it's common to see Israel as bringing the Messiah. American Jews tend not to see it that way, even if they're Orthodox. So listen to Heschel again. If you're going to say that God is in history, that God acts in history, you have a problem with the Holocaust. And there are, for instance, Soloveitchik himself wrote an essay where he argued that God had absented God's self from history during the Holocaust, and God reappeared in 1947 when the UN voted for partition. And in 1948, when the Israelis won the War of Independence, God was on the battlefield. Heschel wants none of this. Heschel says in his book about Israel, the presence of God in history is never conceived to mean God's penetration of history. God's will does not dominate the affairs of men. Of course, Heschel believes in God. Heschel also lost virtually his entire family in the Holocaust. He did not believe that God did it or allowed it or sanctioned it or caused it. So then what's his belief in God's role in history? And it's complicated and I won't go into it now. But the point is that for many Israelis, because the existence of the state is at stake and they're raising their children possibly to be sacrificed for that existence, the ultimate significance of the state is a matter of existential importance that it's not for American Jews. Okay, so we have lots of gaps, and the question is, what are we going to do about them? And now I have to list two factors that people ordinarily bring up. We're going to talk about the Haredim and about the Palestinians. Several people have asked me, how come you didn't talk about the Palestinians? And the answer is, I've been waiting for you to ask me to talk about the Palestinians. First, the Haredim. The fact is, this trend of disengagement from Israel predates the ascent to power of the Haredim, but it's been exacerbated by that. And I'd say if I'm speaking to teenagers as an adult with the wisdom of adulthood, in life you have to learn to distinguish between the problems you can solve and the problems you can't solve. And the problems you can't solve, you try to manage, because you can't solve them. And this, to my mind, is in the category of a problem I can't solve, because the Haredim tend to have 6 or 8 kids or more per family. That's the statistic. And other Israelis tend to have 3, maybe 4 kids per family. By the way, the average for American Orthodox Jews who are non-Haredi is 3. The average for American Orthodox Jews who are Haredi is 6. And the average for conservative and Reform Jews like me is 2. 2 kids per family. So the Haredim not only have lots of kids, but they marry very early. So the generations change in 20 years among Haredim. So all predictions are that the percentage of Haredim in the Israeli population is going to grow every year. If Israel remains a democracy, Haredi voting power will grow every year, and ultra-Orthodox Jews, Haredim, vote as a bloc. The rabbi tells you vote X, you vote X. So they have an extraordinary amount of political power, and it's not going to get less. And for the moment, they're not in the coalition, but who knows how long that will last. And so I don't think we're going to see significant changes in Israeli policy about Orthodox Jews anytime in the future. So I think Israel remains a place that's going to alienate many American Jews who don't like the fact that Haredim discriminate against non-Orthodox Jews in Israel. That, to me, I hate it. I'm not happy about it, but it's a given. I'll try to manage it as best I can. We'll put on as much pressure as we can. We'll make a lot of noise. But I'm not willing to tell American Jews not to support Israel because of this. The second thing is the Palestinians. So I am not here to talk politics, and I'm not an expert in the Middle East conflict, which is why I didn't include it in my talks. My attitude is this is another problem that has to be managed because it can't be solved. So my attitude is that there are things the Israeli governments since 1967 could have done that would have maybe made Palestinians more interested in making peace. We'll never know what could have been if, because it's all hypothetical. I personally don't think Yasser Arafat would ever have made peace with a Jewish state. But Israelis who know more than I do, and Israelis who met Arafat, claim that I'm wrong about this, that Arafat was actually ready to kill his own extreme factions to make peace with Israel. I don't believe it. But maybe he would have. So, to my mind, the question now is what you can do to improve the lives of Palestinians, and the moral grounds and the security grounds come together. So just to put my politics out there, I'm with those 250 Israeli generals and heads of the Mossad and everything who advocated a bunch of steps that would make Palestinians' lives easier and better and relieve a lot of suffering and improve economics, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what I think has to happen. But you can't, if you see a Palestinian leadership that's ready to make peace with Israel, and some Israelis do and they're smart, I don't see it. So is there any compromise, which is the maximum that Israel will give and the minimum the Palestinians will settle for, that can meet? I don't think so. So you're in a holding pattern that's difficult. What you can do is make the lives of West Bank Palestinians much better, and you can certainly give Israeli Palestinians, citizens of Israel, total equality as citizens. And there's beginning to be moves in that direction. The amount of government money that's being spent on sewage and building and all that sort of stuff is now improving. But that's to me in the nature of a problem that's also not going to go away. So if American Jews feel a conflict between their Jewish values and the political realities of Israel, and this is always going to be worse in a right-wing Israeli government because the vast majority of American Jews are still define themselves as liberal. So if that's going to alienate them from Israel, then we've got to try to overcome it by all sorts of other things. I was at a conference in Israel about this subject, and I said, remember a couple of years ago, Israel had the choice of admitting North African refugees. And I said, from the point of view of improving Israel's image in the world and among American Jews, please admit those refugees. It's also the right thing to do. It's the humane thing to do. It's the Jewish thing to do. Can you possibly do it? And they decided, for reasons of what they called national security, that they couldn't. But that's an example of something that if you can do it, if you can solve one problem, do it, because you can't solve other problems, so do everything you can to solve the one problem you can solve. Okay, so here's what I think we can do straight off the bat. And I will list these things in the next 10 minutes or so, and that will leave us ample time for questions. Number one, education on both sides. This we can do on our side, and we can help Israelis do it on their side. First of all, we can do it on our side because we have control of our school systems, our Jewish schools. So insofar as you have Jewish schools and Jewish summer camps, you can make Israel more of a feature. And what I mean by that is age-appropriate education in the reality of Israel, not just dancing horas and singing folk songs and getting to know the Israeli flag. I'm talking about real age-appropriate education. When you're a teenager in America, you've already got serious education about world history, United States history, American politics. Let's have serious education about Israel. And let's do what we can about improving the way Israelis learn about us. Now, one of the ways to do that is because you have a huge influx of Israelis in the country. First of all, the shlichim. Thousands of Israeli young people are in American Jewish camps. They learn the experience of camp. What they learn about American Judaism is what they learn at camp, but there's no systematic effort on the most part to acquaint them with what diaspora Judaism is outside of camp. Something like 300,000 or 400,000 Israelis before COVID came to the United States every summer. The vast majority of them do not go to any Jewish anything. They go to Disney World and Universal Studios and the Empire State Building, but they don't come to us. We can organize this, and the way to organize it and get them into it is to subsidize it and to pay for it and to make it attractive. So that's in the nature of education. The second thing we can do, and Debbie was telling me, so our federation here is already doing it, you can do what's called mifkashim. You do face-to-face meetings, and myself, I can say that this changed my life. I'm here speaking to you about this subject because half of my closest friends in the world are Israeli. When the vast majority of American Jews hear the word Israel, What do they have in their mind? An army? A prime minister like Bibi Netanyahu? A threat, let's say by Iran or some other nation? What they don't have in their mind are faces of individual Israelis. If they have family members, it's a little different, if they're really in touch with those family members. But what we want to do is make it so that every American Jew and every Israeli Jew, when they hear the word American Jew or the word Israeli Jew, has real people in their mind that they care about, so that the relationship becomes a person-to-person relationship and not an institutional relationship. And again, we can do this. It's quite expensive. It's actually cheaper than birthright. But we could do this. It just means resolve and organization. It can happen. The third thing involves leadership. So I'm a person who believes in leadership. I was the head of an institution, JTS, which devotes itself to training future Jewish leaders. It's very, very expensive. You invest heavily. When I think about the amount of money that was invested in me when I was a teen, it's astronomical, but this is the cost you have. I once was asked by my dean at Stanford, who was himself from the Caribbean. He was a black guy who was born and raised in Jamaica or one of the other Caribbean islands. He said, "Why do you Jews devote so much money to keeping yourselves going as a group? Why don't you just depend on the gene pool?" And I had to tell him that we've never succeeded by depending on the gene pool. Like, we don't want there to be discrimination and anti-Semitism. We want Jews to be able to mix and marry whoever they want to, but we want them to choose voluntarily to keep this tradition going. And he kind of shook his head, and then I found out that he and his extended family send all the young members of the family to the Caribbean every summer for some like a cultural summer camp to preserve their heritage as Caribbean people, Afro-Caribbean people. And it was really interesting to me. So we're not the only ones, but we got to spend money on this. And I know, because I was the head of an institution, that it's very expensive to send every future JTS rabbi or cantor to Israel for an entire year. It's a huge tax on the budget. And I'm not bragging now, I'm just telling you what the reality is. So when I came into office just in time for the recession of 2007, 2008, and we cut faculty salaries that year by 2%, 4%, 6%, and 8%, depending on the level of the salary. And we spent $300,000 that year sending a very small number of rabbinical students to Israel for the year. Because your budgets express your priorities. So that's a case where we had to make that sacrifice institutionally, I believed, and we did. So Jewish institutions are going to have to pay to educate leadership, and they have to pay to educate that leadership Jewishly, and we're going to have to pay to make Israel an important part of the experience of that future leadership. The Wexner program, you all heard about the Wexner program, they bring young Israeli leaders to America and try to do the opposite. They educate them at the Kennedy School at Harvard, but they also expose them to Jewish life in the United States. And that's an example of such a program, but it reaches a minority, a small minority of Israeli leaders. The vast majority, unfortunately, of Israeli leaders do not have firsthand knowledge or experience of us. So if the leaders on the other side do not know us, it's bad. But you may have heard the President of Israel speak about this subject. The vast majority of Israelis are not educated in the reality of other Israelis. So if you are a Haredi Jew, do you learn about secular Israelis? The answer is no. If you are a secular Jew, do you learn about Haredis? The answer is no. So the education does not cut across, because Israel does not have one united school system. It has separate school systems for secular, for Orthodox, for ultra-Orthodox, for Arab. So the President of Israel, Ruby Rivlin, said, we are 4 separate tribes growing more separate all the time. And the statistics, unfortunately, in Israel are that friendships and marriages less and less cut across these divisions. So when he came to San Francisco to address the General Assembly of the Federations, Rivlin called us the fifth tribe. I was very happy to hear that. But in order to bridge the gap between the other four tribes and the fifth tribe, you have to find a way to bridge the gaps among the four tribes. And so this is a serious problem. We shouldn't underestimate it. Just one more point, and then I'm going to stop and hear your suggestions. I'm hoping you all have suggestions that I haven't thought of. Israelis are not only not educated about diaspora Jews, they are educated to believe in what classical Zionism calls negation of diaspora, shlilat hagolah. In other words, there's no neutrality. So we talked yesterday about Jewish sources throughout the ages. Jewish sources throughout the ages have a positive valuation of the land of Israel. It is always a positive. In our Birkat Hamazon just now, we thank God for the fruit of the vine and for the rains that flow to the land of Israel. When Israelis talk about the Golah or the Galut, the Jewish communities outside Israel, they do not do so positively. If you look at Jewish tradition, the rabbis wanted to make it possible for Jews to live outside the land of Israel, but they never had a premium. It wasn't a positive value to live outside the land of Israel. And for Israelis, we are galut. We are not just chutz la'aretz, outside the land of Israel. We are galut. We are exile. You can have a sober view or an extreme view. A sober view, which was held by my teacher Eliezer Schweid at the Hebrew University, was that if you are living in the diaspora in the present day, you will lose a substantial majority of your Jews to assimilation or anti-Semitism or both. He didn't say you're going to lose all your Jews, but he said if you get anywhere near keeping half your Jews, you're doing really well. Because the rule of modern Jewish history has been wherever Jews have a chance, a huge percentage of them assimilate. So if you want to know what the statisticians say about American Jewry, it's hard to find an estimate about what a substantially Jewish life is because people disagree about that. But some sociologists I respect agree that even defining a substantial Jewish life pluralistically, like there are many ways to be a serious Jew, you don't find more than a quarter of American Jews living a substantially Jewish life. And here's the statistic that I lose sleep over whenever I let myself think about it, which is that you have 1 million people out there at least who have at least one Jewish parent. And if you ask them, are you a Jew? They say no. 1 million people who have a Jewish parent, at least one, sometimes two, and if you ask them, are you a Jew? They say no. 1 million people. That's like 1/6 of our population right now. So a Zionist like Eliezer Schweid looks at that statistic and says, see, I'm not speaking to you ideologically about Zionism, I'm just telling you the facts. You are losing. If you want to win, there's only one place in the world where Jews can keep Jews Jewish, and that's the state of Israel. So even if you are not ideologically on Zionist grounds negating the diaspora, when Israeli looks at those statistics, they say, see, we told you so. And when the Pittsburgh shooting happened, or when the Paris bombing happened, Israeli ministers flew there. And part of it is, of course, we stand for the Jewish people, and the Jewish people just suffered, so we want to be there to stand with our fellow Jews. But as I also quoted, there's also a, see, we told you so. This is what diaspora means. Not anti-Semitism all the time, but a Pittsburgh, a Charlottesville, this, that's part of life here. It's the price you pay for living in diaspora. And so we go on. So at the end of the day, people ask me, I'm going to close with this, and then hopefully you're going to have suggestions and questions. Am I optimistic or am I pessimistic? And I am characteristically optimistic. But what enables me to be optimistic is I don't count numbers. I believe, be'emunah shlema, that the state of Israel is not going anywhere. I don't worry about its survival. Maybe irrationally so, but maybe because we're all worried so much, we can be secure about it. But I don't worry about it. And I don't worry about the survival of Jews in the United States. I think there'll be fewer of us, many fewer of us. But I don't believe in that our survival is at stake, and I don't believe the survival of the Jewish people is at stake, because I'm looking at these teenagers. We've got to make this choice so rich and attractive, one by one, for every young Jew, that they choose it for themselves and their families, and I believe we can do that. So I believe, I'm going to end with this quote from a woman named Anita Friedman, who is the head of the Jewish Family and Children's Service in San Francisco. And she said this line to me, and it struck me as so true that I'd like to repeat it. She said that we Jews always end up doing the right thing, but only after we try every other alternative. And I believe that's going to be true for us in this case as well. So now we turn it over to you online and in person, and we have to hear your suggestions and ideas. We have lots of time. Where's Andy? So are you going to handle the questions from that group? Do we have any yet on chat? Do we have any in the room?
We have one to start with chat.
Why don't we start here in person before we do chat? Go ahead.
If you would come up to the microphone.
Come up to the microphone. That's the deal. Is this mic working?
No, you need to come up to this microphone.
So we didn't tell you in advance. You have to come and speak in the front from the front microphone. Hang on, I'm leaving. Go there.
No, this one.
So if you had to give this, like a talk like this to teenagers in Israel about like their relationship to Jews in the U.S., what would you tell them?
Oh, boy. I didn't plant that question. I want you to know. Did not plant that question. I think that people who are American Jews will not feel close to Jews in Israel unless they feel connected to one or both of two things: Jewish tradition or the Jewish people. Once upon a time, you could feel connected to the Jewish people without feeling connected to Jewish tradition because it was an ethnic identity and there was Yiddish. We don't have to go into this right now. Chances are good that you and your generation are not going to feel connected to Israel unless you feel connected to the Jewish tradition. It's often called Judaism, but I don't like the ism. So I prefer the words the Jewish tradition, which is a vast tradition. You can be connected to it ethnically, or ethically, or culturally, or historically. There's so many ways to connect to it, but you've got to find a way to connect to it. If it's important to you in your life, I believe that Israel will be important to you because so much of the Jewish tradition is wrapped up in Israel. Our prayers, our Torah, our Bible, all sorts of things. And so I think that the question is, what relationship, if any, are you as an individual going to work out with this tradition of yours? That's the first question before you. And no one can answer that question for you. You've got to find it for yourself. Your family gives you one sort of relationship, but not everybody ends up where their parents were. And historically, I can tell you, it's typical for Americans, Jews as well as Christians, to end up being different in terms of their observance and beliefs than their parents. That's the norm, not the exception. So that's what I would say, and I think it's a wonderful tradition. It's a different topic. I'd be happy to tell you why I think Judaism is a wonderful thing, but that's the question. What is your relationship to Judaism going to be? The relationship to Israel is usually second. There are a few people who go to spend a year in Israel, and they get attached to Israel, and then they come back here and live here, but their main attachment to the Jewish people is through Israel. It happens. It happens less often now than it used to. The vast majority of Jews your age and a little older who care a lot about Israel are Orthodox, because it's part of their Orthodox Judaism to be close to Israel for religious reasons. Right? That's why I would answer that question. It's a great question. Andy?
This is, I think, more of a comment than necessarily a question from, I'm pretty sure it's from Deborah Goldstein. Dr. Eisen referenced our community partnership sponsored by Federation with the Eshkol region of Israel. This program enables face-to-face relationships, pre-COVID teen trips to Israel with home hospitality in Eshkol in the homes of Eshkol teens, initiated close friendships between our local teens and the Eshkol teens. Sometimes the Eshkol teens come to the capital district. Similar opportunities are available for adults. If you're planning a trip, please speak to Federation about including Eshkol on your itinerary. The people of Eshkol look forward to warmly welcoming Northeastern New York to their community. Now, I'm going to expand on it, my personal question. This is one of the cases of success, right, I think. As a member of the conservative movement, and I heard all of the statistics, all of the gaps that you presented, and to me, that points to the failure of USCJ, of JTS, of all the major Jewish organizations. All of those trends are going in the wrong direction, which can only point to our leadership failing. And I'm sorry to be saying this. And what Deborah pointed out is one of the success stories. So I'd like to hear, as a conservative member, what your response is there.
So when Debbie told me about that program, I asked her to make that point here because it is a success. And other programs like it are successful, but there are a number of them which involve Israeli officials, like mayors of towns, who have relationships with American Jewish donors. But what this one does is people to people, family to family, and that's what's exceptional, which I think has to be more of a norm. Now, Andy, the Masorti movement, there are two issues, and one answer I think you don't want me to go into too much, but I'll go into it a little bit. So I'm now going to talk about what you call the conservative movement. We have a problem as a conservative movement because we're not organized well. When Isaac Mayer Wise, this is a history lesson now, so some of the adults will already know this, the teens probably don't. So in the 1860s and 70s, there was an American rabbi who founded Reform Judaism in the United States, brought it over from Germany. He set up the Reform movement. As part of the Reform movement, the movement set up a college. The movement set up the rabbinical organization. The movement set up the camps. The movement has branches in Israel. The college in Israel is owned by the same people that own the college in the United States. We didn't do it that way. We set up JTS, which was actually, as you may know, set up mostly by Orthodox and Reform rabbis who believed that we needed to have another alternative for the immigrants from Eastern Europe because they weren't going to settle for shtetl Orthodoxy and they weren't going to be Reform, which was dominated by German Jews. So we needed to have an institution to train rabbis for the United States of America to serve these millions of immigrants from Eastern Europe. So we got JTS. Solomon Schechter was the chancellor of JTS, and he had to establish an organization for his alumni. So he set up the Rabbinical Assembly, which was his alumni organization. And then he needed an organization for the synagogues that were employing his alumni. That's how we got the United Synagogue. And well into the 1950s, the United Synagogue and the Rabbinical Assembly reported to JTS, but they were subsidized, they were subsidiary to JTS. So when it comes to programs like Israel, where's that fit? So JTS indeed set up a branch of JTS in Jerusalem, and we sent all our rabbis there for a year and our candidates, but we separated, it's too complicated institutionally, but they demanded that it be Israeli owned and operated, and so we let it go, and we now have a partnership with it. It doesn't belong to JTS anymore. but we're still very close to it. But the United Synagogue is an organization designed to serve American conservative synagogues. It doesn't have Israel as a major part of its mission. So when it ran into budgetary problems, it cut the Israel part. The same thing with campus organizations. Why does the Reform movement spend a lot of money on campuses? The Orthodox movement spends a huge fortune of money on campuses. But conservative movement, because it's a movement that doesn't really have an organization devoted to Israel, cut the money for the college programs, sadly. And JTS tried to pick up a little bit of the slack, but we're always short of money. So I want to say that our problems here are not ideological. Our problems are organizational and budgetary, and that is a lesson that a rabbi said to me the minute I took over as chancellor of JTS, and he was proven right time and again. Our problems are not ideological, they are budgetary and organizational. We're not organized the right way. So now for the first time, you have the United Synagogue and the Rabbinical Assembly sharing leadership and budgets and staff. This happened 2 years ago, right before COVID. This is a huge step forward. It's an enormous amount of savings, and it's going to enable us to be more efficient, I think. But what you have in Israel is an Israeli conservative movement called Masorti, which is a much better name than conservative. It means traditional. JTS spent close to $1 million to establish the Masorti movement in Israel, but now they are independent of JTS, and they're pretty much independent of the United Synagogue. They're supported by voluntary contributions, and they get no government support. This is what we're fighting for. We're fighting for government support for non-Orthodox organizations, the same way we have government support for Orthodox organizations. So I think the problem there is that A, we're not organizationally well set up to do this, but B, American Jews, especially active American Jews, especially non-Orthodox active American Jews, who are maybe 10% of American Jews, active, non-Orthodox American Jews, maybe 10% of American Jews. We have to find the resources to support this. And federations have increasingly been unwilling to subsidize what they consider to be denominational enterprises. So the conservative movement in Israel is seen correctly as a denominational enterprise. And so we're not getting a huge amount of federation support. We get some support from the Jewish Agency, but I agree with you. We're not doing our bit. It's crucially important to the Jewish people. But are we going to take money away from Camp Ramah, or money away from JTS, or money away from synagogues to send it to Israel? I hope not. We have to find more money. But that money is not there because the most generous donors on the American scene have not supported the Masorti movement in Israel. That's a fact, I'm sorry to say. That's not where their hearts are. So this is something that you and I can do, and if we can't give money, we can give time and effort, and I can put you in touch with people there if you want to give time and effort or money. When I was chancellor of JTS, I went every chance I could and spent a lot of time and effort on this because it's so important to me, and I agree with you, it's so important to our Jewish future. I'm sorry to give you such a long answer. It was a hard question, it was a good question. We have more time. Yes, Alexandra.
So I wanted to ask about something that I see as a positive and see if there's anything we can draw from it. When I was much younger, in the 1970s, there was a lot of tension in Israel between Ashkenazic Jews and Sephardic Mizrahi Jews. And the anger of the Mizrahi Jews at the Ashkenazic Jews was basically well placed. They had had a very difficult time when they came to Israel. And nowadays, I remember this, but I look at Israeli pop music, and the cultural influencers are Sephardic and Mizrahi. Sephardic and Mizrahi Ashkenazic marriages, no one even notices anymore. I don't know that the issues of equity have vanished, but they sure aren't what they were, 45 years ago. Obviously, one equalizer there is the Israeli army that everyone serves. Are there others, and are there things we can learn from the fact that that divide doesn't exist the way it used to? Is there anything we can take from that or learn from it?
So that question was great on so many grounds. It's greatest because of its optimism. Yes. So here's a story, right, that verifies your point. So when I was doing my graduate work at Hebrew University in 1975, I was befriended by a family. They were connected to the scholarship that I had received, and they had lost their son in the 1967 war, and they were from Poland. They were Polish Jewish immigrants to Israel. And I became friendly with a Moroccan. And the woman in this family would say to me, "Why are you wasting your time with Hamar Kayiheza?" She looked down on Moroccan Jews. It was quite common for Israelis of her generation, of her ethnic background, to look down on Edot HaMizrach. One of my best friends, American, married a Yemenite woman that he met in Israel. And she suffered all sorts of discrimination in Israel, as her family did. She, by the way, also was a target of racial discrimination in the United States because her skin is very dark. And so she got some, discrimination on that score. But you're absolutely right. The problem was solved by marriages and friendships, which is why I'm so keen on person-to-person relationships between Israelis and non-Israelis, which is why I think birthright was the right idea, which is why the only way to overcome stereotypes and images and myths is to give first-hand experiences. And as I said, I'm here today largely because some of my closest friends are Israelis. And so when I see the world through their eyes because I can't not, because we talk all the time. And so I think that these person-to-person relationships are the key, and family relationships. And I think that family is going to save the Jewish people as a people, because we have these ties of family. So we have to increase them and not lose them. Now, let's be honest. A lot of American Jews are not happy when their kids move to Israel. If my kids move to Israel, I don't know how happy I'd be about that. It's bad enough that I have a daughter in Los Angeles, right? But we got to get over this. So that is the key, I believe, and that is a source of optimism in Israel, you're right. And the same thing you say that the Jews from the FSU, from the former Soviet Union. Those marriages also have turned the tide, and they're not like a separate Edah anymore. More and more they're mixed in to the larger Israeli population. Now, what will happen with Israeli-Arab friendships and marriages? It's a way off. Some people fear that if we integrate neighborhoods, etc., the result is going to be marriages, and that's bad for the Jewish people. We're so far from that. I'd rather end the discrimination and worry about that problem down the line and find other positive reasons to maintain ourselves. But yeah.
So we have a roadmap for living in the diaspora and maintaining Jewish tradition. It's called the Talmud. Okay, it's called the Talmud Bavli, right? I mean, so we have this two. Oh, okay, sorry. We have this tradition, this traditional text, and it's worked for literally 2 millennia to make this connection. What we don't have, as far as I can see, is a roadmap for doing this in a secular context. And what I mean is that even when you talk about all the traditions in Israel that they follow, where do we learn about that you have to read the book of Esther on Purim? It's the Babylonian Talmud, right? It's Tractate Megillah. Where do we learn that we have to light Hanukkah candles? It's Tractate Shabbat, right? How do we light Hanukkah candles? Which order do we light Hanukkah candles in? What are the important traditions? All of this, and all of this, curiously enough, was written in part, or certainly interpreted and developed in part, by diaspora Jews living in Babylonia, right? The community in Israel, was dying after CE 200. So my question is there any viable roadmap that doesn't involve a background in Jewish tradition and a real embrace of Jewish traditional text written primarily in the diaspora?
said that was the last question, Andy? Was it, well, okay. The answer is no. But we're young, and that's the source of hope. And it's hard for a human being, because our lifespan is pretty short, to think in terms of the history of something like the Jewish tradition or the Jewish people, which extends for several thousand years. And I keep reminding myself, and your question reminds me again, that we only have a state for what, 73 years? And a lot of people have said this, so that's the United States in the 1840s. Right, and the United States in the 1840s was not that well developed and that pretty a place, right? And its major defining battle was ahead of it, and we haven't escaped from that battle yet, 200 years later. The battle over slavery, right? So, let's give it time. Now, there will be cultural resources developed in diaspora, and there will be cultural resources developed in Israel. The cultural resources developed in the diaspora because they had no choice. We had a minor, impoverished settlement in Palestine under pagan and then Christian and Muslim domination. We have a Palestinian Talmud, it's true, there were Palestinian academies, but they were nothing compared to the academies in Bavel, because we didn't have a community to support it in Palestine like we did outside Palestine. Now we have the majority of world Jewry in Israel. So it's to be expected that the locus of Jewish creativity will in large part be Israel. But they can't do what we can do, because they don't face the needs that we have. They don't have the problems that we have. So they don't have to develop culturally the same way we have to develop culturally. When I say have to, I think of feminism. There were committed Jewish feminists who knew that they couldn't sacrifice their Judaism to their feminism, and they wouldn't sacrifice their feminism to their Judaism, so they had to develop a Jewish feminism. That's the example of something you have to do culturally. Israel does not have to deal with certain problems that we have to deal with. And it's good for Judaism that we deal with those problems as Jews and develop Jewish traditions that deal with those problems. So increasingly you're going to find Israeli Judaism and American Judaism, I think, going in somewhat separate directions. And we've got to convince them to study our Talmud at the same time as we study their Talmud. I believe we can, because I'm an optimistic, and I think we're going to find a way because we have another choice. So I think we will find a way. But it's reassuring, you know, there are Jews, you know this, I hope you'll take this in the right spirit. When I come to this synagogue, there are a lot of Jews in New York City who don't believe you can exist here. There are a lot of Jews in Israel who don't believe you can exist here. When I went to Dallas, Texas, as the chancellor, they thanked me for coming to Dallas, Texas, because they said, too often we hear that if we were serious Jews, we'd be living in New York City, and people don't believe because we live in Dallas that we can possibly be serious Jews. There are serious Jews all over the place. And it's the serious Jews who are going to keep the tradition going. It was the serious Jews that wrote and studied the Babylonian Talmud. It was not the masses. The masses can't read it. So I know elitism is not popular, but you have to depend on small, critical masses to preserve the Jewish future. And I will. I don't worry about the survival of our people. I don't worry about the survival of our Torah, because the same way it gripped you and me, I called my book Taking Hold of Torah, the Torah takes hold of us, right? And that's why we're here. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Eisen. You gave us so much to think about, so much to consider. We came away this weekend with a lot of information, and we are all going to think about Israel and the American relationship very differently. Just as a reminder, though, we are going to be starting a new series led by our rabbi, Together and Apart, the Future of Jewish Peoplehood. Today, the worldwide Jewish community faces challenges to our unity, including claims of nationalism, anti-Semitism, dual loyalty, and identity politics. This class will help us consider what it means to be a member of the Jewish people, discuss the core values that animate Jewish peoplehood, and confront the contemporary challenges to Jewish unity. The curriculum examines the forces dividing the Jewish people today, and it imagines new conceptual frameworks that can sustain and grow the story of our people for a new millennium. This course is going to start in January. Look for all the announcements in our bulletin and weekly announcements and everywhere else you get information about a congregation of Good Adahim. Sounds like an amazing class, so please sign up for that. Once again, thank you everyone for attending this weekend. I thought it was a spectacular weekend, and again, Dr. Eisen, thank you so much. This was really wonderful.
We should all give Andy, Bob, and the adult education committee a huge round of applause also. Thank you, everyone.
That one basically died.
We had it going while we were even doing it, and I have very little battery. It was at 100% when we brought it. I just like no battery.
Even though it was plugged in over there, it didn't seem like it was charging. It might have been the outlet.
Yeah. Okay.
Andy, thank you so much. Really, from the bottom of my heart, I think that was really good. I'm going to drive this to the train.
Who's driving it?
Yep. And thanks for announcing the class.
Well, it seemed to just fit in exactly. I got soccer referee too. I think it's till 5.